Hi guys, I'm starting something new called Throwback Thursday, and I'm going to find an episode that pairs well with the last episode and replay it for you. So this week, because we covered Eleanor de Guzman, the pairing episode with it is going to be Philippa of Hainault, who was my second episode ever. So enjoy! Hi, welcome to Long Live the Queen, where we talk about the women who made history. And by we, I mean the royal we, because it's just me. If you want to get a hold of me, you can email me at longlivethequeenpodcast@gmail.com. This week, we're going to talk about Philippa of Hainault. Last week, we talked about Isabella, the she-wolf of France. This week, we're going to talk about her daughter-in-law, Philippa of Hainault. Other than being related to the French king, the two women didn't really have much in common. Philippa of Hainault was born in 1314, in what is modern-day the border of France and Belgium. Sometime in her childhood, there was talk of her or one of her sisters marrying Prince Edward, but nothing really came of it, and the relationship between Hainault and England had started to deteriorate a little bit. Edward was busy. He was fighting his wife for the throne and whether or not his son was going to be put on it. Just nothing came of it until Isabella traveled to France to get an army for her son. In 1326, Queen Isabella and her lover Roger Mortimer traveled to Hainault to make a deal. You may remember this from last week. Prince Edward would marry one of the Count's daughters within 2 years of this arrangement. The Count would provide an army, Roger would lead the army, and Isabel would be the figurehead to get her son on the throne in place of her husband. Spoiler alert, just in case you didn't listen to last week, Edward II was deposed, and his son became King Edward III officially, crowned and anointed. Later that same year, King Edward was married by proxy, meaning he sent his assistant, to Philippa of Hainault. A few months later, in 1328, Philippa arrived in England at the age of 13 to marry the king in person. He was now 15. Young, for sure, for marriage, but back then, not so young. And at least they were age appropriate, so it's definitely the direction we want to see. Philippa and Edward were king and queen in name only. They were still very young, and Isabella and Roger were running the country. During that time, King Charles VI of France died. Charles was Isabella's older brother, the youngest son of Philip the Fair. He was also heirless, but his wife was pregnant when he died. Maybe it would be a boy. If it was a boy, France would again have a king. The late king's cousin, Philip of Valois, was made Lord Protector while they waited for the baby to be born. When the baby was born, she was a princess, and France didn't let girls rule, meaning that the Capetian family line was at an end, and the Valois family line had started, with the late king's cousin, Philip of Valois, becoming King Philip VI. Back in England, Isabella, being female, wasn't eligible to rule France, but she argued that her son, King Edward, was eligible, as nephew of the late king and a male, and grandson of Philip the Fair. Philip of Valois argued that because women couldn't take the throne, men who got their claim through a woman couldn't take the throne either. And of course, Philip was French, and Edward was very, very English. The French barons agreed with Philip. This was the initial stirrings of war. No war yet, but both the King of France and the King of England claimed to be the King of France, and that wasn't going to be put to bed anytime soon. In order to strengthen England, likely against France, Isabella married her daughter to the son of the Scottish king, Robert the Bruce. who died the following year, making his son King David II of Scotland, and Isabella's daughter, Queen of Scotland. Isabella was now the mother of the Queen of Scotland, the mother of the King of England, and, if you asked her, the mother of the King of France, though her cousin Philip disagreed with that last part. Isabella had been cooperating with her late husband's half-brother, Edmund, who had supported Isabella and Roger against his own half-brother, Edward II. After Edward II's death was announced, likely murder, his half-brother had started to become disillusioned with Isabella and Roger's government. He also started to suspect that his brother wasn't even dead, that he was just being hidden somewhere so he couldn't be saved. And he hatched a plan to rescue his brother and put him back on the throne. But he was found out. Likely, his half-brother was, in fact, dead, and Isabella and Roger had him executed. They also put his wife and his children on house arrest, including 2-year-old baby Joan. Babies under house arrest. That's where England was. Not a cool place. Isabella was the only anointed queen in all of England. Philippa had never had a coronation, so while both Philippa and her mother-in-law were queens, Isabella had been anointed. She was top queen. This had to change in 1330, when 15-year-old Philippa was pregnant. She had to be crowned and anointed before the baby was born. If that baby were to be a boy and the future king, it would help him a great deal if his mother was anointed before his birth. At nearly 6 months pregnant, Philippa was finally crowned. A few months later, Queen Philippa gave birth to Prince Edward. Because of course they named him Edward. What else would one name a future king of England? This seemed to be the point at which Edward and Philippa decided they were in charge. Edward, now nearly 18, had become rebellious, and with his wife's support, he had his mother and her boyfriend arrested. This was kind of his "I'm the king now" moment. Roger Mortimer declared, very confidently, that his word outranked the word of the young king, so he couldn't be arrested. So, treason. Oops. Isabella, as was the tradition of a medieval queen, threw herself down at her son's feet begging, "Fair son, have pity on gentle Mortimer." It didn't work. Mortimer was executed, and Isabella was put on house arrest. Isabella's PR machine was up and running again. Now she was the innocent victim of the villainous Roger Mortimer. She was just a poor, defenseless, and most importantly, innocent woman. Sure, Jan. The king was unbothered by his mother's begging. Queen Philippa may have seen her moment to be head queen in charge. She begged her husband to spare his mother, as any good medieval queen would. Edward agreed, for his wife, to spare his mother and allow her narrative to become official. She was tricked by Roger Mortimer. It wasn't her fault. I don't buy it. Isabella was hardcore, maybe Royalty Hall of Fame level. She was intelligent, and I don't believe she was tricked by some man. Edward released his aunt from house arrest and invited her and her young children to live with them at court, including baby Joan of Kent. No more babies on house arrest. That is the direction we like to go. Edward and Philippa seemed to want a different kind of court. This court was exactly what you would imagine a medieval court to be if you closed your eyes and thought about it. Chivalry was key. Be nice to girls, but don't let them be in charge of anything, because Isabella had been a lot, and the people wanted a break. Philippa, who was also French, wanted to make it very, very clear that she was not her mother-in-law. Edward started having monthly tournaments. Again, exactly what you would think of if you closed your eyes and imagined a medieval tournament, jousting and all. The queen and her ladies, who were all English, she was not trying to remind anyone that she was French, would show up to the tournaments dressed beautifully, so that the men, sometime in matching armor, would have someone to show off for. They were all still teenagers, so it kind of gives off a pep assembly vibe. Imagine it like 1330s High School Musical. They were being the change they wanted to see in the world. For the elites, that is. They didn't invite the peasants to compete with them. They would never. If you've ever seen A Knight's Tale with Heath Ledger, that was kind of the vibe. A Knight's Tale is mostly made up, but it is how the 1330s looks in my head. One of the characters in A Knight's Tale is Chaucer, like the Geoffrey Chaucer, the poet. We'll get back to him later. He's a key figure. Also in A Knight's Tale is Edward the Black Prince. In the movie, he was an adult, but for now, he's still little baby Prince Edward. So back to the tournaments. Monthly show and tell for the men to show off their war talents. Once, the ladies were in the stand watching the tournament, and the wooden stand collapsed right out from under them. No one was hurt badly, scrapes, bruises, that kind of thing, but the king was furious. He demanded the builder be executed. Queen Philippa, who'd been on the stand when it collapsed, dropped to her knees and again begged her husband for mercy, asking him to spare the builder's life. We don't know why exactly. It could have been to strengthen her reputation as a kind, sweet, loving queen. It could have been to help her husband's reputation. It allowed him to look tough while allowing him to show lenience because he loved his wife. He was a good man and a good king. It could have also been that she was genuinely compassionate, wanting people to have second chances. I like to think it was all three. She was smart, but also compassionate. Queen Philippa is usually seen as a nearly perfect medieval queen. This could be because she was an intelligent, kind, well-adjusted woman. Or it could be because she was the patron of the chronicler Jean Froissart. Because she was. She paid for him to travel around Europe and write down first-hand accounts of battles and local history. Every time Philippa was mentioned in his chronicles, it was overly flowery. Never was there a more beautiful, gracious, and generous queen in all the land. But she was also writing the paychecks. Edward and Philippa spent the next 25 years together whenever possible, fighting wars and having babies. She had 13 babies over the next 25 years. You aren't going to have to remember all 13 of them, but some of them are key moving forward. Because of this large family, every English monarch from this point until the current King Charles III was descended from King Edward III and Queen Philippa. This was the House Plantagenet. The other English royal families, the Lancasters, Yorks, Tudors, Stuarts, Hanovers, and Windsors, all descended from this one royal couple. They're kind of the starting point of a very, very long family tale. The cycle would go like this. Philippa would have a baby. The baby would go to the wet nurse. When Philippa was recovered, she would join Edward on campaign, usually against France or occasionally Scotland. She would, in short order, get pregnant again and go home to have the baby, and the cycle would repeat. Prince Edward was born in 1330. His sister Isabella was born in 1332. The royal couple moved the capital to York, and for now, things were chill with France. So war with Scotland was the thing because you gotta fight somebody, and France was being okay at the moment, and Scotland was maybe a little easier to beat. The king and queen seemed in love. One night, the king went to stay at a monastery. The queen couldn't stay there because she was a woman, and women were not allowed to stay at the monastery overnight. And it was so unusual that the royal chroniclers wrote it down. In an age where people didn't even write down the birth of their babies or marriages, they wrote down that the king and queen slept apart that night. Because it was so unusual, they thought they needed to write it down. In 1334, Princess Joan was born, and France had decided that they were on Scotland's side in this whole Scotland-England war. So, war with France was back on. Then William was born, and unfortunately, he didn't survive long. The war was ramping up with France, and King Philip had taken back Edward's title, Duke of Aquitaine, just like had been done to his father and his grandfather, the French king holding Duke of Aquitaine over their heads. Because after all, you need to pay tribute. This was the start of what we now call the 100 Years' War. It actually lasted about 114 years, but the 114-year war isn't as poetic sounding. In 1338, Lionel was born, and in 1340, Joan was born. If you were keeping track, the royal family now consisted of Edward and Philippa and their children, 10-year-old Edward, 8-year-old Isabella, 6-year-old Joan, 2-year-old Lionel, and baby John. In addition, the royal nursery also held 12-year-old Joan, the king's cousin, formerly the baby on house arrest. Joan was now 12, and she entered into a secret marriage contract with 26-year-old Thomas Holland. I don't love the age difference, for obvious reasons. They kept it a secret. Joan stayed living at home, and Thomas left the country in search of trying to become the man who would be allowed to marry the king's cousin. But we'll get back to that story later. In 1341, 42, 44, and 46, Edmund, Blanche, Mary, and Margaret were all born respectively. Blanche, unfortunately, didn't survive long, but the other three did seem to thrive in the royal nursery. Again, for anyone who's trying to keep track, the royal nursery now consisted 16-year-old Edward, 14-year-old Isabella, 12-year-old Joan, 8-year-old Lionel, 6-year-old John, 5-year-old Edmund, 2-year-old Mary, and baby Margaret. You don't have to remember all of the royal couple's children. It just illustrates how busy the royal nursery had been. The older children, of course, would not still be in the nursery. Edward was with his father at war, for one. But it was always full of children. Just as soon as one child aged out of the nursery, another one would take its place. In 1346, the 100 Years' War was raging. King Edward and his son Edward, the Black Prince, were away fighting in France. King Edward had left Queen Philippa and her 8-year-old son Lionel in charge back in York. Scotland and France were BFF now, in a the enemy of my enemy is my friend kind of way. So while the king and his heir were in France fighting, Scotland invaded the Queen and the Spare in York. There is a story of Philippa riding in front of the army on a white horse, encouraging the troops to fight bravely for their king. I don't know if it really happened, and it probably didn't, but it makes a good story, and I really hope it did. And it would definitely make it in the movie version if they made one. Philippa's army did, in fact, win, and in the process, captured King David of Scotland. If you remember, David was married to King Edward's younger sister, Joan. Edward kept his brother-in-law in the Tower of London imprisoned for 11 years. But, being a good brother, he allowed his sister to visit her husband. The following year, Prince Thomas was born. King Edward and Prince Edward had laid siege to the French port city of Calais. The siege lasted an entire year, so once Philippa had recovered from Thomas's birth, she joined them, and when Calais finally fell after a year, Edward ordered the 6 burghers to be executed. Philippa, being Philippa, dropped to her knees and again begged her husband for mercy. Say what you want about Philippa, she was dramatic, but at least she used her drama to save lives. Edward acquiesced and the men were spared, because Philippa was good at what Philippa did. They returned to England, the proud new owners of Calais, and tournaments ensued. In 1348, Europe had to take a break from war. The plague had arrived in full force. Between 1348 and 1353, the plague killed half of the population of England. Half. With the first 2 years being by far the worst. Princess Joan, against her advice, left for Calais to marry Pedro of Castile. He was later known as Peter the Cruel, but we'll get back to that too. Because everyone is related, and everyone comes back in the story. Joan, unfortunately, died of the plague before the wedding could ever take place. Thomas, a year old, also died of the plague, and that same year William was born, but he also didn't survive. For Philippa, 1348 was an awful year. She had lost 3 children all that year. Even the royal family wasn't safe from the plague. There were no other royal births recorded for the next 7 years, until, in 1355, Philippa, at the age of 41, had her last baby, also named Thomas. During the plague years, King Philip of France had died, and his son John II was now claiming to be King of France. But so was Edward. So the 100 Years' War started back up. Edward was able to capture King John. And after a lot of negotiations and a lot of treaties, England was officially granted Calais. King John was released, and so was King David of Scotland. Edward had proved that he was top king. His sister Joan declined to go back to Scotland with her husband. She was fine with him staying in jail, and if he was going to be king again, she was going to stay in England and live with her mother, Dowager Queen Isabella, who was trying to live her best post-Roger Mortimer life out in the country. Philippa, now 43, was in a hunting accident and dislocated her shoulder. She was never able to hunt again, and that was one of her favorite pastimes. But her shoulder did not allow her to use a bow and arrow after that. Philippa's health was still degrading by 1360 when her daughter Mary, who was 16, and her daughter Margaret, who was 15, both passed away. Mary had some kind of sleeping sickness. They couldn't wake her up. They couldn't rouse her. She passed away. And her sister Margaret, we don't know what she died of, but the plague is always a good guess. Edward, the prince, not the king, Edward the Black Prince, had married Joan of Kent, the same Joan of Kent that was the house arrest baby and the secret marriage at 12 girl. She was now married to the Black Prince, and she'd lived a whole entire life in between there. But we're going to have to, again, get back to that later. They had 2 children at this point. Edward, because of course, Edward's everywhere, and this child would be the future king of England, so of course we're going to name him Edward, and his little brother Richard. Queen Philippa, possibly sensing that the end of her life was near, started signing things if the queen predeceases, meaning, hey guys, if I die, please do this anyway. It's important to me. In 1368, her son Lionel got sick and died. It was suspected that he was poisoned. She definitely considered it a murder. And Queen Philippa died the following year in 1369, at the age of 55. Her dying wish was that when Edward died, he be buried with her. He lived another 8 years, but he was, in fact, buried next to her. She got her dying wish. For anyone still trying to keep track, Philippa's still living children were Edward the Black Prince, now 38, Princess Isabella, 36, Prince John, 28, Prince Edmund, 27, and little Thomas, who was still only 13. The Edwards were all in line for the throne, but, spoiler alert, things go down, and in less than 100 years, there would be drama. John and Edward, who were only a year apart, and very close in their lifetime, their grandchildren would end up fighting against each other in the Civil War that we know as the War of the Roses. And that is where we will leave it until next week. Kind of a bummer at the end, but overall, I think Philippa lived her life the way she wanted to. She had an image of what a queen should be, and she did seem to nail it as far as how she wanted to go, and her legacy still holds. She was a wife and a mother and a queen, and I suspect that is everything she wanted. Any comments or shoutouts can be sent to longlivethequeenpodcast@gmail.com. And for this week's shoutout to our modern day queens, I'm going to shout out my Aunt Eileen, who is #goals all over the place. She's everything I hope to be someday and more. Thanks for listening. See you next week. Bye.